Learning to work on your own bicycle can be described as a journey. It's a journey of learning, it's a journey of experience, and it's a journey of building your toolkit. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build your own home mechanic workshop and which tools to buy. Now, you can go out and buy complete toolkits by companies like Park and Pedros. They start around a couple $100, maybe $250, and they can go all the way up over $6,000. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is to just kind of build it a little bit at a time. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through the tools that you need for a pretty complete toolkit or home workshop. And I'm going to do it in the order of necessity. So starting with the really basic tools and working up to the more advanced tools. Another way of building your own toolkit is to do it on an as-needed basis. So if you're trying to tackle certain jobs like changing derailleur cables, things like that, you'll go out and get the tools that you need for that specific job. But I'm going to start by going over the basic tools and going all the way down to some pretty advanced tools. And I did make a video also on what to carry on a bike ride, and you may want to refer to that for some basic tools that you need to carry every time you ride. So let's start with the basics for your home workshop. The first is going to be a good floor pump. Now yes, you can just grab the mini pump that you should carry when you ride and use that, but these are really not designed for filling your tires on a daily basis. They take a lot of strokes to get your tires pumped up. So I would recommend getting a good floor pump, and don't cheap out on your floor pump. Get a good one. Again, companies like Park make good ones. This is one made by Giant. It's called the Control Tower. I won a couple of these in some races, and this has been a really good pump. Now I would also recommend getting one with a gauge on it, and make sure you get one that does Presta and Schrader valve. Even though Presta is what you're going to use most of the time, it's nice to be able to do Schrader as well. Also a good company that I like is Lezyne, or Lezyne, however you want to say it. They make some pretty good quality pumps as well. So a pump is a number one necessity for having in your workshop. Another thing that you're going to need is a really good set of Allen wrenches or hex wrenches. This is one that I like because they're separate. Almost, I would say probably 60% or more of the work that you do on a bicycle is done with an Allen wrench. So get a good set. Now, I would recommend getting ones with the ball on the end so you can kind of do it at angles. Now, you can't use a lot of torque when you use the rounded end, but you can angle the wrench, which is really nice. And then on the other side, it's got the just the standard end without the ball. Park also makes one with the triangle type. It's got 3 Allen wrenches, and it's usually a 4, 5, and a 6 millimeter is what you're going to need. And by the way, you do need a metric Allen wrench set, not an English, because most bicycles use metric. So a good set of Allen wrenches. Now, when you're building your kit, you can, if you want to use your multi-tool again that you should carry on every ride, you can do that. But since you do so many things with Allen wrenches, get a good set. And then you're going to need a set of tire levers for taking your tires on and off the bike. Now this is again something that you would have in your toolkit that you carry with you on every ride. So you could use those, but it's kind of nice to have an extra set sitting around in your garage. Moving on down the list, the next thing I would recommend buying is a good torque wrench. This is a Park TW5. This one goes up to 15 Newton meters, which is the one that I would recommend buying at first. Now, if you buy a torque wrench, you're probably also going to need a set of Allen wrenches that go on sockets. And because that's what most torque wrenches use, is to be able to put a socket on there. And again, metric, and this is a Craftsman, and I would recommend going from around 4 millimeters, maybe 3, up to about 10. And so you're going to need the socket. Now, this is the kind that actually bends a little bit, or some of them click when it gets to the proper torque spec. That's the one I would recommend buying. I have another one that I use for higher torque specs. This one goes up to 70 Newton meters, and this is the one with the gauge. And so you have to watch the gauge. These can be hard to use, especially if you're working at some weird angles. So if I got one of these again, I would get the kind that clicks. So you may need to get a torque wrench that goes higher than the 15 Newton meters, but this is the one that you're going to need for stems and things like that, where there's a lot of carbon. Torque wrenches are important not necessarily for under tightening at times, but also for over tightening. It can be easy to crank down on a bolt on a stem, for example, that's only rated to 5 or 6 Newton meters, and you can over tighten it, and you can crack some carbon if you do that, if you have a carbon steer tube or something like that. Next, I would recommend a dedicated chain cleaner. This is the kind where you dump the solution in. You can use a regular brush on a chain. They make gear brushes that you can use, but I like these for cleaning the chain because keeping your drivetrain clean is really important. And you just put it in there and spin the chain backwards and it gets the chain clean. So these are real nice. Next, a set of metric open-ended wrenches. If you have a tool shop already, you may already have these. And you're going to need ones that go down to maybe 7 millimeters up to 17, 18, 19, around there. 10 is a really popular size on bicycles. 15 is a popular size for pedals. Now, also for bikes are cone wrenches. These are open-ended wrenches, but they're thinner. These aren't used quite as much today. These were real popular on hubs where you had to get some caps off to get to your hubs and get the bearings out. So hubs that used open bearings and not cartridges. Today, bearing cartridges are more and more popular on wheel sets where you just tap out the bearings when they go bad and tap in a new set of bearings. So you're not necessarily having to get those caps off to get to the bearings. So these still may come in handy though. And you may come into some situations where you would want to have these cone wrenches. You'll need a set of screwdrivers, and again, you may already have these, but you're going to need a Phillips head, flat head, a larger one, and then Phillips and flat in a smaller size. And especially for doing things like derailleur adjustments, use a smaller screwdriver. So get a good set of screwdrivers. Next, I'm going to recommend a Park chain checker or another brand type chain checker. This is a Park CC2. This is something that I use a lot. Don't go by time when you look to see when you should change out your chain. I've had chains stretch out in 2 or 3 months. I've had chains last a year. The only way to really tell how a chain stretches out is to use a chain checker. And so this is something that I highly recommend. And you've seen me use this in some of my other videos if you've watched other ones on my channel. A basic tape measure is nice, and I like one that has metric and English. Again, you may already have one of these. One thing that I use a tape measure a lot is to check my saddle height. I'm real particular of the saddle height, and I write down my saddle height. And so if I have to take my seat post out, or if I go somewhere and get a rental bike, I like to know exactly what my saddle height is so I'm not just guessing once I find out where I like my saddle. A digital pressure gauge is really nice, especially if you use different pumps. So you may use a mini pump, you may use a floor pump. I find that on mountain bikes, tire pressure is even more crucial than on road and cyclocross bikes. And you may go out and ride and for certain types of conditions in terrain, like a certain tire pressure, and you can write that down. But having one gauge that you use, even, I told you that I want a couple of the giant floor pumps. Even gauges among the exact same floor pump can vary by 2 or 3 psi. So the only way to really get it nailed down is a digital pressure gauge like this. Next, I'm going to recommend just a set of needle nose pliers and just various jobs you may need to grip things, or some regular pliers, not needle nose, are handy to have for certain jobs. You'll need a patch kit. This is again something that you're going to carry with you on every ride, but when you pick some up, just grab a couple extra for your workshop. It's nice just to have it sitting there in your toolbox. This kind is the glueless one, which for tubes is what I would recommend. It's just you peel it off, stick it on the hole, and you're done. If you ride tubeless mountain bike tires, eventually you're going to come to a point where you puncture the tire and the Stan's fluid or whatever fluid you use is not going to seal it up. And then you would have to go in from the inside and patch the tire. And if you do that, you're going to need the kind that has glue, and then you put a patch on. And by the way, Stan's website has a real good tutorial video of how to patch a tire, and so I'd recommend watching that whenever you do come to that. But you're going to need a glue patch kit for that. You're going to need a chain tool eventually, and I like having a dedicated one. Now, on your multi-tool that you carry with you when you ride, you may have one there, and since a chain tool is not something you use very frequently, you can get away with using this, but a dedicated one is going to be easier to use. You can see how big this handle is compared to a multi-tool, and so this is going to be a lot easier to use. You may have also seen in one of my how to install a chain video, this homemade tool that I made out of a coat hanger, and this holds the chain so that when it comes time to put the link in, excuse me, that it's a lot easier to do because the chain is not stretched out. So this is something that I would recommend making just out of an old coat hanger. Now this really isn't a tool, but it's cable ties, and these come in very handy in working on a bike. So grab some cable ties from your hardware store, and the best thing that I found to cut cable ties is a set of toenail clippers. So you can use some old toenail clippers to cut the excess off a cable tie. If you are a mountain biker and you have suspension on your bike, you're going to need a shock pump. It used to be that companies, when you bought a bike or a fork, would include one of these with it, but I'm seeing that less and less, so you may actually have to go out and buy a shock pump, but this is very important for mountain bikers. Next on the list is a work stand. This is something that I use almost on a daily basis, whether it's cleaning a bike, working on a bike, just trying to get it off the floor, whatever. So this is probably going to be one of your most sizable investments if you're building up your toolkit piece by piece. I like this kind. This is a new stand for me, and I actually may do a review on this one, but this is the kind that actually you can turn this and crank down and then clamp down. I had one before where it had the spring, and it took a while to get it adjusted because some bikes I'll clamp by the seat tube, some bikes I'll clamp by the top tube, and they're different diameters. So having one that's easily adjustable like this is the kind that I prefer. This is the Park PCS4. These will range from maybe $100 up to several $100s. This one I think is around the $200 range. It's height adjustable, kind of folds a little bit. The legs kind of fold in. Not super portable. You can get some, so if you go to races and things like that and you like to have a work stand, probably want to get one that folds up. This is not one that I would describe as portable, but again, it's something that I use all the time. You may have seen this in my bike cleaning video, but an air compressor is something that I use for quite a number of applications. I use it for obviously installing tubeless tires, for drying off the bike after I clean it, and for cleaning other parts. If you get one of these, get the nozzle like this where you can jet air out to dry off things or clean things out, and also get the tip that you can use for filling tires. And if you do press the tires, you'll need to get the little adapter that screws onto the Presta valve so that you can use this tip to fill the tires. Now we're going to get into some more advanced tools, and first on this list are going to be tools that remove the cassette from your bike, so the sprocket on your bike. And you're going to need a lock ring tool, and this is one that has a kind of a thing that goes through the axle, which is what I recommend. It just holds it into place better. So this is to remove the lock ring from the cassette. You're also going to need an adjustable wrench to hold the lock ring tool, and you probably already have an adjustable wrench somewhere lying around your house. And you're going to need a chain whip. Since there's a freewheel in your rear hub, you're going to need a tool like this, a chain whip tool, to hold that cassette into place as you loosen the lock ring. Now I do have a video on how to remove and install a cassette from a bicycle, and that video will show you how to use these tools, so you may want to watch that. Next, I would recommend a good set of spoke wrenches, so for truing wheels and for building a wheel. I've actually never built a wheel from scratch, but you're going to need at least a set of spoke wrenches to true your wheels. These can also be used to remove valve cores from like Stan's valve stems, and so that spoke wrench comes in handy for that as well. A set of picks can be useful for certain jobs, especially for getting O-rings out of things. If you do your own fork maintenance or shock maintenance, you can use these to get to certain picks. I've even dropped things down in a frame or trying to fish wires through a frame or derailleur cables. You can use these little picks, And these have different kind of tips, as you can see. And these are made by Craftsman. And so this is something that I would recommend getting somewhere along the line of building your toolkit. This little tool is a Park CNW2. It's to hold the back of a chainring bolt. If you've ever tried to loosen or tighten a chainring bolt and it spins on the back side, this is the tool that holds it into place. You can use a flat blade screwdriver, but that is not the most secure. You can strip that bolt. So this is a cheap little tool that comes in handy for holding those chainring bolts into place. You will eventually need a set of cable cutters for cutting derailleur cables and brake cables. And I would recommend getting the one that cuts the inner wire, in other words, that little metal wire that goes inside for mechanical shifters and brakes, and also one that cuts the outer wire. And so again, this is something that you'll eventually need in your workshop. Next up in the more advanced toolkit will be something to bleed your brakes. The Shimano brakes use mineral oil, and I like this funnel. And again, I have a video that shows how to do this, but this comes with a little plunger that you can stop up the whole base and everything like that. Now, if you use Avid brakes, you may need to pick up the syringe kit. Avid makes a brake bleeding kit that has 2 syringes. But for the Shimano, I use the gravity method and just use this funnel. Now we'll get even more advanced by talking about tools that install and remove bearings. If you have a bike with an external bottom bracket like a Shimano, you'll need a tool like this that will actually go over that bottom bracket and remove those. Now, Shimano cranks also have a little cap on the non-drive side, and they make a little tool. This is a cheap little plastic tool that comes in very handy for getting that cap out. This particular tool, the Park BBT9, actually has that on the end, so it's kind of a 2-in-1 tool, which is nice. You can also get the kind of bottom bracket remover that's by itself. It's a little bit smaller, so either one of these will work. For getting bearings out that are pressed in, for example, a head tube or a bottom bracket area, you'll need something like this that goes in to the shell, like the bottom bracket shell. So what you would do, so if you're trying to remove this bearing, you'd actually put it in this way. It's going to hit the edge of the bearings, and then you would tap it out with something like this soft mallet. So you would tap on the end here and get those out. Now, the reason I have 3 of these is because there's different size bearings. For example, head tube bearings may be different than the bottom bracket bearings. So depending on the size that you're going to be working on will depend on what type of tool you need. I actually have 3 of these to cover pretty much the whole spectrum of bearings that need to be tapped out. If you're removing bearings out of hubs and out of frame pivots, you're going to need something like a set of punches. Now, you can use a screwdriver, like a good flat blade screwdriver, to tap those out, but having a dedicated set of punches I think works a little bit better. Again, this is something that you would tap out with a soft mallet. For smaller cartridge bearings like this that go in frame suspension pivots and also in hubs, you're going to need a small bearing press, and these come with all kind of different adapters for different size bearings. For example, for this 6902 bearing, it fits right inside that bearing, so you don't have any play when you're pressing in the bearings. So again, small bearing press for the smaller cartridge bearings. For larger bearings that are pressed into head cups and bottom brackets, you will need this larger size bearing press. So this is, again, one that goes through either the bottom bracket shell or the head tube, and you just press in the bearings. A truing stand is something that can come in handy if you've got to true a wheel. You can also true a wheel inside a frame. You can cut a cable tie and put it near the rim and true it that way. But if you want a dedicated truing stand, especially if you're going to build a wheel from scratch, this would be very important. Now let me show you a few tools that would be used if you want to cut a steerer tube of a fork. So if you buy your own fork and you want to cut it to install in your bike, you're going to need a couple of these. One, if it's an aluminum steerer tube, you can use a standard tube cutter that you can pick up at a hardware store, where you just kind of go around and tighten this a little bit every revolution. So you can cut an aluminum steerer tube with that. If you're going to be cutting a carbon steerer tube, you will need a cutting guide. So this is a threadless cutting guide. This is the Park SG-6, and this you would put over, and then you would use a hacksaw and put it in there to get an exact cut. So again, don't use a tube cutter on a carbon steerer tube. If it's an aluminum steerer tube, again, you're going to have that little star net that goes inside. It's actually called a star-fangled nut. But this is the star nut setter. So you would thread the star nut onto here, take a hammer, and tap that down inside the steerer tube to set that perfectly down inside the tube. And so again, that's for the star nut. I do not have what's called a crown race setter or crown race remover. Those are some pretty expensive and very specific tools that aren't used very much. And the crown race is that little race that sits on the top of a fork that the headset bearings sit onto, and that usually has to be tapped down onto a fork and also has to be removed with a specific type remover. And I don't have those, but if you want to get very, very advanced, you could pick up those. Again, they're very expensive, and I just use those at the bike shop. Let me just mention a few other random tools. This is one that actually can take the ding out of a rim. This is called a rim wrench. And so you can actually, if you ding a rim, in other words, didn't have enough air pressure in your tire and you hit a root or rock and dented the rim, this can sometimes get the dent out. Another random thing that's nice to have in your workshop is a scale. This is one that just goes in my work stand. And not a necessity, but it's always nice to know how much your bikes or components weigh. And also, this is not used very often, but if you have an old style crank that presses onto the shaft of your bottom bracket, this is a crank puller. And again, this is not used very often, but you would thread this and it pulls that crank off. Most cranks today, either like the Shimano, come off with that little top cap and the Allen wrench bolts, or they have a self-extracting bolt. But if they don't have a self-extracting bolt, you would need a crank puller. This is a nifty little tool that's not going to be a necessity in most workshops, but it's a derailleur hanger adjustment or alignment guide, the DAG1 by Park. And if you ever bend the derailleur hanger, you can thread this into the derailleur hanger. Actually, you have to remove the derailleur first. It's real quick. And then you would go around the rim, and I'm not going to show how to use this, but this would actually straighten the derailleur hanger. So this can come in handy. And I actually keep this when I travel and when I go on mountain bike trips. I keep this in my toolbox because sometimes you're going to bend that derailleur hanger. It's nice to have. And let me wrap up the video with some grease and cleaners and lubes and things like that I would recommend. And I'll start off actually with not a cleaner or lube, but this gear brush is very handy to have. This is one that can clean your cassette, your chain rings, and even the chain if you don't have a dedicated chain cleaner. It also has a side that cleans inside the teeth of a cassette. You're going to need some chain lube. Obviously, I lube my chain every ride or every other ride. So something, I don't like the wax-based ones. Those come off too quickly, but I like things like Pro Gold or this Rock and Roll lube. I like spray lube for things like derailleur, so have some of that. Rubbing alcohol I use all the time for cleaning, degreasing, especially getting brake rotors and things like that clean. Stands, no tube sealant. If you run tubeless, this is obviously a necessity. I also like this injector. If you want to add some stands fluid very quickly without having to remove the tire, you can just remove the valve core. Again, with the spoke wrench will work to get that valve core out, and then you can just inject it in there. You can even measure out kind of exactly what you need to put in that tire. Some biodegradable degreaser. I use this for cleaning my cassette and chain and things like that. This is a concentrated, so I actually dilute this a little bit. I use about half of this and half water in my chain cleaner. For grease, if you use carbon, you need a fiber-specific type grease. And to give you an example, I had a carbon seat post that was creaking inside a carbon frame, and I put some of this in it, stopped the creak immediately. Some other type of grease is important. I put a dab of grease on all of my bolts before I put them back into the frame if it's not a carbon frame. Or usually actually even the carbon frames have an aluminum type hole for the bolts. So I put a dab of grease on bolts, obviously for open bearings and things like that. WD-40, I do not recommend ever using this on a chain or as a lube, but it is nice to get some rust out of bolts. And also if you have an aluminum frame and aluminum seat post and it creaks, WD-40 I found works the best. So you just spray a little bit inside the frame or on the seat post. And finally, brake clean. If you ever have to patch a tire from the inside, if you're running tubeless and you got to patch the tire, not the tube, but the tire, you can clean the inside of the tire really good with brake clean. This will also clean brake rotors and things like that. So there you go, tools of how to build your own workshop. Now, I've been building my workshop for over 20 years and accumulating these tools over a long period of time. So I've obviously showed you a lot of tools, but it did take me a while to build these up. I'm going to follow up this video with one that talks about kind of, you know, some tips and tricks of working on bikes, but more kind of an encouragement video for those of you who are starting this journey on working on your own bike. And I'll share some of the stories that I've had and how I've learned to work on bikes. So thank you so much for watching.